preference values stem from the belief that there are no objective core values. They're back to Nietzsche and his philosophy. And so they are subjective, and they're values that you have as opposed to values that you are to be. So in the preference values, you have this idea that nothing is right and nothing is wrong because it stems from the belief that there are no core values. There's no right and there's no wrong. It's all a matter of choice, and it's a matter of preference. And they lead to a doctrine that's very powerful in the community. The doctrine of relativism underpins modern education. Relativism is the belief, the doctrine, that nothing is right or wrong, and that truth and falsehood vary with the opinions of individuals or particular groups. So the measure of whether something is appropriate or inappropriate, right or wrong, good or bad, is determined upon time, place, and circumstance. So we can say that it all depends. That in relativism, the correctness of a value is rather like beauty. It's in the eye of the beholder. So the criteria are always time, place, and circumstance. Let me give you an example in practice. There was reported that a woman had been taken to the court, prosecuted, for using a famous four-letter word in a public bar. The prosecution was dismissed, and the reason was that the use of the word was seen as hardly inappropriate in the time, place, and circumstance in which it was used. Now, a police spokesman going on to comment on this case made the point that if this woman had said this word in the foyer of the town hall before the National Orchestra played, it would have been seen to be wrong and she would have been prosecuted. He went on to explain that time, place, and circumstance are the criteria. Now that's relativism. Another example might be the famous underarm bowling incident when Australia and New Zealand were playing cricket in Melbourne about 1981. Remember New Zealand was batting, and there were 2 balls and there were 7 runs required. After 1 ball, there were 6 runs required and it would be a tie. And to avoid that situation, the Australians chose to bowl underarm. You see, time, place and circumstance determined how these particular cricketers would behave. Now that's the idea of relativism, that there are no absolutes. Now it's a theoretical construction that makes the management of schools very difficult. Because, you see, a teacher or a principal may talk relativism. They may hold to the belief that nothing is right and nothing is wrong, and that all depends on time, place and circumstance. That what is right for one person may be wrong for another. What may be right in one situation may be inappropriate in another. And then something happens. Someone punches someone in the line. Someone steals the teacher's lunch. Someone is incident to the teacher. Someone arrives drunk for the school assembly. And the teacher and the principal immediately behave as if there are some objective values, objective standards. So you get this tension between relativism and the need for order in the management of classrooms and schools. So I say relativism is a theoretical construction that doesn't work in practice. Now, it makes it difficult for the teacher, but it also makes it difficult for young people, because young people interpret it as meaning that all behaviour is acceptable. And so they are surprised that they are chastised or reprimanded for some particular behaviour. So it causes all sorts of dilemmas for schools and for families and for communities. But there are other reasons why relativism makes it so difficult for us, even though it underpins our education and our public policy. And it is because it gives rise to what I call twin siblings. The first of the siblings is radical individualism, the belief that the individual is autonomous and supreme, and that one's overriding goal in life ought to be gratification and success. So if nothing is right and nothing is wrong, the individual becomes the centre of the moral universe. And all of us will always act in our own best interest. It's important to realise that one of the results of radical individualism is the fact that there's no court of appeal. And the school principal, though he may or she may want to act as the court of appeal or the final authority, really isn't under the philosophy of radical individualism. The other thing about relativism is that it gives rise to the second twin sibling, and that's the destruction of what I call the dynamics of virtue, the dynamics that tie people to good behaviour or to goodness. They're very powerful and they're very simple. The first is embarrassment. Now, embarrassment is so powerful that it causes all of us to tell lies, because the reason we lie is to avoid embarrassment. Think of the last time you told a lie, and it was the time when you were avoiding embarrassment. The second one is a sense of shame and a sense of guilt. And finally, conscience. The fourth dynamic that ties communities and individuals to goodness. Now, we've got to be careful about this. You know, there's a question of balance. We're not talking about ridiculing people. We're talking about recognising that those dynamics play very important parts in the order and organisation of our schools and our communities. Now, embarrassment, shame and guilt don't belong to the judiciary or the legislature or to the police force. They belong to the informality of the home, the street, the schoolyard. And in the case of conscience, they belong inside people's heads. Now, in terms of those dynamics of goodness, it's important to keep in mind balance. And I'm always reminded of the drunk who tried to get on a horse, clambered up one side and promptly fell off the other. It's a question of balance. And we tend to be a bit like a drunk trying to get on a horse. What's the problem then with these values that are preferences? Well, the problem is simply this, that they give rise to relativism. And relativism gives rise to these other twin siblings, radical individualism and the destruction of the dynamics of goodness. And they become barriers to character. And character is so important because it leads to responsible behaviour, citizenship, a sense of community, and a civil society. And they are barriers to the management of schools and classrooms, and they're barriers to teaching and learning. And they also make parenting an unnecessarily difficult task.